Hello and welcome to episode 14 of Ben's Learning Lounge, where today we are covering the more serious topic of depression. Now this includes specific conversations centered around the male experience of depression, reasons for such high depression rates, the flaws in diagnosing depression, who are the most in danger of suicide, religion, the root of depression, and more. Now I'm joined by Mr. Joseph Salmieri Jr. Joseph is a good friend of mine from the US who's battled with depression for about 6 years, despite only being 19 years old. He's managed to get through the darkest of times, and like myself is a practical-minded individual when it comes to dealing with depression and approaching it from a problem-solving perspective as opposed to a victimization one. We've both dealt with severe depression, suicidal ideation, and life-changing health problems, so I couldn't think of a better person to explore this topic with me in detail. Be aware that some audience members may find the topic of these conversations particularly upsetting, but Joe and I have made efforts to keep the conversations relatively light. We are not doctors, nor do we have qualifications in the areas we discuss in this podcast, so we may not get everything right. But I believe anecdotal insights and philosophical discussions can only be a benefit to others who may be in a similar circumstance, or to those who want to understand the experience of depression further. If you believe you yourself are dealing with a depression or some other form of mental illness, do not hesitate to call free helplines such as the Good Samaritans, or whatever exists in your country. There is a strength in relinquishing your control of believing you can deal with this alone. There's nothing more purposeful than facing the dragons head on with help by your side. Enjoy the episode. So hello Joseph, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Ben. I'm really glad to be here, man.
Alright, so jumping right into it, let's sort of get a sort of baseline going about depression and specifically I suppose what they call clinical depression. So would you say that you have or have had clinical depression? And how would you say that that separates from the sort of general experience that people get from, sort of feelings of sadness or loneliness, that sort of thing?
Yeah, definitely, at least twice in my life, I've definitely had just diagnosable clinical depression. As for how it's different from just like sadness, well, when you're grieving, definitely can mimic what depression is. In fact, a lot of grieving people might have minor depression to some extent. Just because when you're grieving, you've lost something really important to you, whether it's your home, whether it's your family, whether it's a friend, something like that. But just everyday mundane sadness, like, here in the States, let's say, American football, we're getting close to our Super Bowl, which means it's down to the playoffs, and the Rams beat the Cardinals. Woohoo! A lot of people will be sad about that because it's like, the Cardinals lost, boo-hoo. And like that sadness, it doesn't affect your day-to-day life. You don't have a loss of interest in hobbies. You don't have a loss of interest in your wife, your girlfriend, your friends in general. You don't lose the motivation to go do the things you enjoy doing, like even if it's just going outside or going to work. If you're sad, you don't wake up the next morning thinking, I don't want to get out of bed, unless you already have depression on top of the sadness. But I think a lot of people just go, well, I'm having a bad day, so I have depression. And it's become, like, I don't know how many times I've been, on online forums or whatever, and people are just like, I'm so depressed right now. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, maybe you're just negatively feeding yourself, and you're just choosing to spiral down the sadness path. Like, today, let's say it's a sunny day, and you can go outside. Well, that's more of like a sadness or like a disappointment than it is depression. But it's become such a thing for Gen Zers to be depressed or anxious or to have any, like, if you notice, a lot of people, especially people of my generation, Gen Z, if you look on their like Twitter profiles or Instagram profiles, outside of the stupid, ridiculous pronouns that can show up sometimes, like Z or whatever the heck, I don't even keep up with those anymore. You'll have things like depressed teenager or gothic. And typically, I'm not slamming gothic people at all, but a lot of Gen Zs turn to the gothic phase when their mental health is kind of down, or just to act all edgy, which I don't know why edgy became popular. I mean, it's kind of cool to be like that silent guy in the corner of the room who can kill everybody, but at the same time, just like wearing black and having black like everywhere and just looking like you want to kill somebody or yourself. I don't know why that's popular.
No, and I think that there's really an issue there, right? Because I think movements like that has definitely not helped a lot of people with depression. It's definitely caused a sort of the delegitimization process of what people consider depression, because it becomes associated, as you sort of bring up there, with these sort of goth-like teenagers who perhaps are being rebellious. They like listen to Billie Eilish, all that sort of thing, and they believe that's what it means, or that's what it is to be depressed, and they almost want to have it because it's almost a status symbol at this point.
No, yeah,
The amount
it is
of
a status
TikToks
symbol.
I've seen about ADHD, about this is how I, look at the ADHD walk. I see videos like this, or look at my depressed brain whenever I want to do some work, and like these kind of fun, jivey videos that, in some cases, they can be brilliant because they're a great cathartic way for people to release that energy. But in a lot of ways, it just feels like people are just engaging with it because they want to have it and they want to feel different. So that's always kind of bothered me.
They want to be special and they want to have attention. They want both of those things. And if you want both, then you'll stop at no end. There'll be no reason to stop when you're getting that attention. TikTok is huge. Like, you don't have to be someone special on TikTok to go anywhere. Like, when I had TikTok, all I did was like react to people's videos, and that's like my face just doing weird things. And one of my videos got like 3,000 views. Like, that doesn't that hasn't been something that could happen outside of the past 10 years. Otherwise, you had to hope that somebody would read your book, and that would get popular.
Yeah.
And reading a book and writing a book is a lot harder than taking your phone, making a video, and posting it. Like, I've seen people go viral for the dumbest crap. It's just a need for attention. And a lot of people fake that, with depression, which I don't understand why you would want to have something that makes your life so miserable.
Well, I think it's because they don't fully understand it. I think they see it as almost what I think they compare it to? I'm not one to watch anime, but they kind of see it as sort of like you mentioned, that kind of lone guy or lone wolf type of person who goes against the grain, and they have issues, but at the end of the day, they're the main character and they're the ones that everybody secretly kind of likes. I think that's what they think depression is.
But depression is like that wimpy kid in anime, which, again, I don't watch anime, but I do know that it's a common stereotype where there's like this wimpy little kid who sits in the back of class, gets bullied in school, has like the black hair, is just like real, isn't buff, none of that.
Yeah.
That's more like what depression is. That's how it manifests for a lot of people. It's like they feel weak, vulnerable, like they can't do anything, like they're worthless, things like that. It's not like a macho vibe where it's like, you know what, I'm going to wear dark colors and kill people and I'm depressed. No,
smoke menthols.
There's no correspondence there. Yet people, like we said, want the attention, or they just don't understand it, which I never really realized until I had depression, that like there was an actual difference. Because growing up, 14, 15, I was like, maybe I'm depressed, maybe I'm not, I don't know. It's because a few of my friends on Discord had said they were depressed or whatever, and I was like, okay, cool. And then I got depression. I was like, oh, this is really what depression looks like. I never knew that when people described it as a storm cloud, that they actually meant it's a bloody storm cloud, not just like a rain shower.
Yeah, you can compare it to falling in love. I mean, that's quite dark, but you can compare, the sensation of not understanding what something feels like until you really have it,
Right.
When you actually do fall in love with someone, there is a genuine thing that everything sort of connects at that point. You go, oh, this is what it's like. This is why, like, every bloody song's about it on the radio, And I think perhaps maybe it's the same with depression there. If you can explain it, you can explain pain to someone. If they've never felt pain before, you can explain it as well as you want. But they'll never truly grasp it until they actually are forced to deal with it properly.
Right. Yeah, that seems pretty accurate to me.
I wanted to explore, because we can talk about these sort of almost perhaps more obvious signs of depression when it's someone else experiencing them. So you can sort of see when there's sort of a lack of motivation. Maybe they look tireder. But what does it actually feel like in the head of someone who has clinical depression? What is that sensation like?
It can vary day to day, I think, at least in my own experience. There'll be some days where it just feels like the moon is sitting on my chest, and all I could do was, I shouldn't be speaking in the present tense because it's nowhere near that bad at this point, and it would just feel like I couldn't do anything. It was an effort to get out of bed, and then later on when it was time to eat or something, it was like an effort to get off the couch. I'm trying to think, how do I explain the effort? It's like trying to lift literally the entire moon while you're laying on the couch. It's that heavy of an emotional response to whether it's a gut malfunction, or you're just a negative thinker and it's gone too far, or something terrible has happened to you, you're injured, whatever it is. And There'll be other days where it manifests itself as extreme frustration or anger. Like it'll just be I'll be irritable all day long, and it's not like I'm angry and there's something specific. It's like I'm irritable and I'm frustrated and I don't know why, and it won't go away. And oftentimes that's often linked to being dehydrated or hungry too, which when you're depressed, it's another thing that a lot of people don't really understand is it's not easy to eat and it's not easy to make sure you're taking care of yourself. So there have definitely been days where I'm like, I'm in a bad mood and I just don't want to do anything, so I'll do nothing. And then it's evening and I have had just breakfast and I'm like more irritable than I normally am.
Yeah, what you've touched on there as well, there's a sort of an active level of self-sabotage there too, which I always found interesting when I went through my sort of worst depression periods. I would say my worst depression periods were probably about 2 or 3 years ago now. You know, it's interesting reflecting on that from someone who's sort of been able to at least come out of that period and then reflect on it properly. But what I found is that the amount that sort of part of your brain talks to you, that part that's usually there to support you, is constantly nagging you. I found that insane. It's constantly talking down on you. And I mean like everything. If you start really trying to focus in on it, it's everything. You know, you eat something for dinner, maybe you have like a nut bar and your brain is like, why the hell do you think that you deserve that nut bar? And it's like, well, I don't need to deserve it. I can just have it. But you cannot be convinced otherwise, you know. Maybe you go to sleep and your brain's like, well, you should have stayed up another half an hour and done this. Or you stay up later and your brain goes, well, what the hell are you doing? You clearly need to sleep right now. It's like this constant antagonistic figure. And that for me was one of the worst parts. And I think that might be what's leading to that frustration that we feel, because that's not really that conscious of a thing. It doesn't feel like it's actually talking to you. But when you start trying to hone in on it and understand what's going on in your brain, I feel like there is, you know, a little figure that's constantly trying to talk you down.
Yeah. One thing I've learned over the past 2 years, I guess, because has it been? It's 2022, not 2021 anymore. Yeah. My worst depressive episode was 2019 into 2020, and it had nothing to do with COVID. But then COVID also knocked my legs out from under me because of the responses of governments and whatnot. But yeah, that's something I often forget about, is how negative self-talk is really prevalent, because I've always been more of like a pessimistic type of guy. As far back as I can remember, my mom's always been telling me, hey, you need to think more positive, practice gratitude. And I'm like, screw you, come on, let me be realistic. That was my thing, was like, it's realistic to be pessimistic, because something bad is always going to happen, and if I believe something good will happen, I'm going to lose that hope because it's going to not happen. But I never realized how prevalent it was, and I think you hit on something there with just, if you hone in on it, it's everywhere in a lot of depressed people. I definitely had to struggle with that a lot. The biggest thing that helped me with that, though, was gratitude. It was like just choosing at night to like shut off my brain and think, thank you. I'm religious, so I was saying, thank you, God, for X, Y, and Z, and that I think was massively helpful, because by the time I was done, I'd fall asleep. I was like, thank you.
I wonder if actually that's something we could touch on perhaps in a little bit. It is whether secularization has actually led to an increase in depression. So that's something I want to come back to, actually. But I sort of wanted to add to people who haven't perhaps experienced depression, that voice inside your head, it becomes so powerful that it is sort of a mind of its own. And the best way I can think about it is when you're in a dream, that's your brain controlling everything in your dream, but it feels like you're in another world, right? But at the end of the day, everything you see in your dream is your brain constructing it. The same power, I believe, is in that sort of voice that you hear. It's part of you, but it feels so separate to you that it's got its own mind and its own feelings almost, and its own beliefs. So it will always find a way to talk down on you, and it's not like you can just switch it off like you switch off a computer. You know, it's almost like this little bastard that's just kind of stuck on there, you know, that you have to try and deal with. But I think once you begin to recognize it and realize what it's doing, things get a lot easier, but that takes a bloody lot of work.
Yeah, that's a key part there, is recognizing that it is an issue. Because if you don't recognize it's an issue, you're not going to try and figure out how to fix it.
Yeah, maybe people over-identify with it, I think. I think that's a big issue.
No, definitely. Like I said, for me, I was always a pessimistic type of guy, and I was like, well, this is who I am. And then I went through that depressive period, and as I started coming out of that, I was like, I was a bloody moron for the first 16, 17 years of my life. What was I doing? I need to be focusing on more positive things. And that doesn't mean like, hey, look, it's rainy today, but maybe the sun, it's still shining behind the clouds. Like, that's not what positivity here means. It means choosing not to focus on the negative things and instead focus on what's good in life. What can I enjoy right now? What am I enjoying right now? Being more present. I always thought it was really cheesy and dumb until I had to do it, and I was like, this is really important. This is really, really important.
I've been trying to do those gratitude morning and nighttime routines. I forget constantly, but I put it in my calendar now to make sure like I'm just three things, and I always kind of mix it up. There's like one thing that I'm grateful for that happened that day, then one thing that I did that I'm grateful for, and I think there's like more of a general sort of grounded sort of what's one thing I'm happy grateful for in general, and that kind of mixes things up. So it's not every day you're going to bed going, right, okay, I'm grateful for my family. Finally, I can sleep. It gives it a bit of, it mixes it up a little bit, so it keeps your brain on alert.
I think that bit right there when you said the second question was I'm grateful for something that I did today. That's really important, because to counter the constantly nagging little pixie in the back of your head that's going, you are an evil person, every time you do something, is to counter it with, well, what did I do that was good today? Whether it was I got up and took a shower. If that's the best thing you did that day while you're in the midst of a really bad depressive state, that's incredibly awesome. Like, I have a hard time accepting those things about myself, and so it's really, I know other people do too, especially when you're in such a deep spot, and it's really important to focus on what have I done that's good, even if it doesn't feel like it. Even if you're not feeling it, if you go, all right, what did I do today? I went for a 5-minute walk. Great, good job, me. Thank you that I have the ability to go for that walk, and I went for that walk. And then just like, it's just one thing. It's really important, and I'm glad that you have that on that list, because that's not something I remember to do very often.
Oh, that's my favorite one. Yeah, I went with when I went through the worst time. I think me and you are reasonably pragmatic people, which I think gives us more interesting conversations here. I thought, well, clearly, the best thing to do is to get myself into some therapy. I mean, that seems to work for some people at least. And one of the things that we did, so if anyone at home is dealing with this, perhaps this is a helpful trick of the trade, is you sort of get a list of about 50 different characteristics or 100 different characteristics that people have. And what you do is you then list them from top to bottom of the ones that you find most important. So you want to get them into your top 20, then get rid of the last 10 and get your top 10, and then get rid of the last 10 and see what your top 5 is. Because then once you start to realize that you've got your own character, your own personality that's separate from the depression, it makes it feel like such a more of a little thing, and it's also just natural gratitude that you have those characteristics, So it's something that I found was massively helpful, and I would recommend.
Gotcha. Yeah, I hadn't heard about that one, but that seems like it definitely would be very useful.
I have quite a big question for you, and one that I'm not entirely sure of the answer of, so it's definitely going to be a conversation. Do you feel depression is sort of a result of how one has perhaps conducted themselves in life, or do you believe it's closer to a disease? And I'm wondering what angle you're going to take this from, because obviously there's always the religious angle. That kind of nature versus nurture. Is it what we're doing, or is it just the fact that it happens to us?
I always approach it first with, what have I been doing that is a potential problem? I don't dismiss the fact that it can be a disease for some people, especially after listening to Jordan Peterson's lectures. Not quite as extreme as he is regarding what it can and cannot be, I think. But definitely, like, a large part of the depression I've had, and I need to give myself some grace just to say, yeah, but I've also had gut health issues, which is absolutely horrible for mental health. But for me, half of what it was I just sat at home playing video games, didn't socialize with people, didn't get exercise, didn't get sunlight, and that's an action that leads to a consequence. Even if it's an inaction, it's still technically an action. And for me, just to be specific for me for a second, those things led to a greater, I think, risk of depression, because as I became aware of it, I was like, fudge, I'm an absolute moron. On top of the fact that those things have negative consequences just by not doing the opposite. Like, getting sunlight is really important. Not spending an entire day sitting is really important. But I think a lot of people, especially in the Western cultures, I don't think it's largely a disease, as was preached pretty heavily, I think, for like much of, I don't know, between 2015 to 2020. I think it's more so things we eat, the things we don't do, things like that.
Yeah.
I don't diss the fact that there's just some people out there who just have depression and there's not a reason for it. Their gut health is fine. They work out. They have a wonderful life. I don't know if I have an explanation for those people, but I'm I want a solution, so I would probably not accept it if a doctor told me, or any number of people told me, hey, you have depression. We can't find your gut's fine. Everything's fine. I would not be able to live with that. I would have to find a reason as to why.
No, I'm the same. I feel like I'm very similar to you there. I think there's definitely there's a middle ground, isn't there? I think there's a lot of it is to do with how you act and perhaps how one is led up to that situation. You know, like you said, through inactivities, or perhaps there's that sort of slow, gradual progression from becoming a pessimist to someone who just absolutely sees no point in anything, nihilistic, I suppose. And that slowly builds up over time. But at the same time, I think those things, it's almost like a buckaroo, you know, there's a certain point where you just break the camel's back and it becomes too much. And then that's when you sort of tip over into that disease-like thing where it starts affecting more of your hormones, you know, your thyroid, your ability to produce serotonin and dopamine, because that becomes habitual, your actions, and that then has the knock-on effect of the brain and the brainstem and the gut even, that leads to depression. I wanted to bring up a fact here really quick too, is that it's 9% of men in the US have daily feelings of depression or anxiety. That's daily. So that's 9% of men in the US are suffering from clinical depression. So I wanted to hear your thoughts about what you thought might be causing that. Now, we've initially spoke about this before, and listening to your podcast that came out like a year ago, one of the reasons that you sort of thought was a big issue with this was social media. So I was wondering to know whether perhaps that opinion is changed, adapted, strengthened. So I wanted to go a bit into that.
Definitely a bit less extreme on it, because before I was of the mind that nobody can control their consumption because even just a little bit of social media is enough to cause an issue. But social media specifically, I think it's changed a bit, like my opinion on it, regarding, okay, so how much consumption equals depression? How much time, you know, what the content is. I think generally, just generalizing it, if all you're doing is scrolling for a few hours every day, just scrolling on social media, I think that is a contributing factor, because what do you see? You see people's lives, whether it's a friend you know or just somebody you follow who maybe they went to the gym today, and that makes you feel bad because you didn't go to the gym today. Maybe they went to a party and you didn't go to a party. Maybe they have a hot girlfriend and you don't have a hot girlfriend. You know, also just the term is now like doom scrolling or whatever. I just like to call it, you're scrolling through a bunch of news. It's just straight up, that's all you're doing. And when you're scrolling through bad news, which that's all Twitter is, a lot of Instagram is that, it's just negativity. And what happens, it's the same thing that happens with people who believe in climate change is going to end the world in 10 years. It's, wow, life is so terrible, there's no hope. Now I'm going to get depressed because it feels like there's nothing I can do to solve that problem. So I think social media is definitely a contributing factor. I wouldn't say it affects everybody the same way. I know I would say, and I say this with false confidence, that everybody is affected in some way, shape, or form by social media, but I think it varies from person to person and how much of it you're consuming. Because if you have a time limit on it and you obey that time limit, let's just say it's 30 minutes a day, and you're not just gorging on it all at once, I don't think it's too much of an issue. But I definitely think that social media has led to a lesser of quality of life when you just consider depression as a whole.
Yeah. No, I would agree. I think that the use of social media, first of all, we don't fully know the impact of social media at all, considering it's been around for such a small period of time, given how long humans have been around. But, you know, especially when you're someone who perhaps sees themselves as quite competitive. I've definitely been quite a competitive guy in the past. And when I see someone perhaps who's doing quite successful, when I was at my worst points, then I would see that as almost a serotonin reduction, because it's a challenge. I'm seeing someone who's way more successful than me than something doing incredibly well. And all I can see then is, well, Ben, why the hell aren't you doing that? You know, you're a competitive guy. There's no reason why you can't be in that arena. So constantly looking at things like that is just going to put you down. What's really interesting is, now that I'm in a much healthier mode, when I see people doing that kind of successful, I'm seeing guys who do it amazing at the gym. That's more motivational now. I don't see that as almost a confidence reduction as much as it is a confidence boost to be like, all right, yeah, I could do that. Yeah, let's give it a go. You know, perhaps that's unhealthy too. Perhaps identifying yourself with other people's sports and hobbies and whatever it is unhealthy. But it's interesting to see that shift of when I was healthy and when I wasn't.
Yeah, I had a similar shift, and I get the first like major I shouldn't say first, like the major depressive episode I had, I was like, I would use Instagram scrolling as a way to get dopamine, just to make myself feel good because I felt like crap all day. And then I did research because that's who I am. Like when I got depressed, I was like, bloody hell, I need to figure out what the heck is going on here. And it wasn't like, I'll wait for the doctors. I was like, screw the doctors, man. The antacid, what are the side effects? Fudge, that explains what's been going on for the past 8 weeks. Okay, how can I combat this without going and taking drugs? Because I'm a very skeptical person, and given how I've reacted to drugs previously, I was like, I'm not too sure about diving headfirst into something that seems to be, even the doctors themselves are like, well, we don't know what could happen. You could become addicted. You might never get off them again because your brain just can't function without them. We don't know. But here, take them.
They're way too happy to give out those drugs. Way too happy.
Opioids, anyone?
Yeah, well, that's definitely a US problem, but SSRIs as well over here. It's just like, they don't do any tests about depression, which I find quite bad.
Yeah, but how would you get a test? I mean, I think the problem with depression is how do you get an objective test to say, what is this person's level of depression? How do we treat it? Because everybody is different, which means subjectivity comes into play regarding symptoms and how it's affecting one's life. Like, how can you find something objective to test for it? I don't think there shouldn't be a test. There definitely has to be a way to test for it. But
perhaps
the question
not
is,
a
how
test
do we do it?
to identify depression, but at least to identify factors of depression. So, for example, I'm aware that people with depression tend to have like an enlarged amygdala in their brain, which like that's responsible for like fear and pleasure, but it's because of the fear, the cortisol aspect that is built up. So, just measuring things like cortisol, I think would be at least some kind of measurement of something for people, because then they can work on that. If people kind of know what some of their issues are, if they happen to be someone who has a higher level of cortisol, they can look at reducing that. Perhaps they have issues with their gut, right, as you mentioned. So I think, 95% of serotonin, I think, is produced in the gut. So
yeah, something like that.
Yeah, if they're aware that people have gut issues, work on that. But never did I ever go to the doctor and they went, right, okay, so we need to look at your cortisol levels. We need to look at how your gut's functioning, your microbiome. And then from there, we can sort of take steps. They go, so there's this drug called the SSRI. you wanna try that? We can charge you a few quid a month, and off you go.
Mm-hmm. I was reading a book. The guy was writing. I was given it during like my darkest time because the guy was writing about spiritual warfare. It was interesting to read, if nothing else. Definitely, I think it helped me a bit just with like a morale booster, because I'm still not sure how spiritual warfare actually works. Like I know as a Christian, there is good versus evil in the world around us, demons versus angels, whatever, and that demons like to attack Christians in any way they can within their limits. But in the book, he mentioned that out of nowhere, for no reason that he could figure out, he'd been like outside of just like he'd been really busy with conferences for like 6 months straight. He was just flat depressed. He couldn't get out of bed. Nothing. It was pitch black in his mind all the time. And he went to the doctors, and thankfully the doctor wasn't like, let's just give you antidepressants. The doctor said, all right, we're going to run some tests. And they found he had almost zero testosterone in his body.
Wow. Okay.
So they put him on testosterone, and within, I think it was like 3 months, he started to get better, and he was on antidepressants for a little bit just so he could get through the dark period. And then once he got back into himself, the testosterone's important for guys, really important.
Yeah, that's insane.
And once it started to come back, he was like, okay, all right, now I can continue being me, got off the antidepressants, and was on his way. So I'm not ever going to be like, antidepressants are bad for everyone. I just think it shouldn't be a first resort and really shouldn't be something used long term.
I think perhaps the industry's been taken over a little bit by the psychiatrists. I think they've tried to take a handle on depression as being, okay, well, depression's in the brain, therefore we just need to look at it as perhaps psychosomatic symptoms and looking at how that person can develop themselves through depression to deal with themselves. But sometimes there are more accurate or even simple answers, to that. Like you said, perhaps it is that they do have a lack of testosterone. Perhaps it is that they have gut issues. Perhaps it is that, God, their dog died. There are all sorts of reasons why people can get into a depressed state. But the fact that they think a one-size-fits-all approach is going to work, and we just put you through therapy and that alone will work, isn't really going to happen. Especially when men, I feel we're quite pragmatic and we want to try different solutions.
Well, it's interesting because before the podcast, I was doing some quick reading on like what's the difference in depression between like men and women, because we're biologically different, which means there has to be a different response because of the way our chemical makeup is. And it was interesting because some of the things listed were ladies are a lot more prone to show sadness and be sad, whereas guys are a lot more likely to be angry or frustrated, to take greater risks with their lives, to just be more likely to just not even take a look at it, be like, I can get through this, unless there's a physical ailment involved, which struck me because, like, when I get depressed, like I said, I get frustrated or angry. I'm a bit more emotional than the average guy, so I definitely am not afraid to be like, hey, I'm in a bad mood, I'm feeling pretty crappy, depressed, whatever you want to call it, to like my friends and my family. Like, that's how I got through my.
But crying is harder, though, right?
I can't cry.
No, neither can I. I can't cry either. And I think when I was going through a rough time, that would have been very helpful.
I would have loved it. Like,
yeah.
I tried so many times and I shed like no tears. I was like, can I cry? But I did notice something, and I don't know if you've ever had this, where I would just feel like I was crying. There was like never any actual tears.
Yeah.
And then afterwards, I felt refreshed, like I had actually had a good cry. And I was like, what is this? I didn't actually shed any I know tears, like the tear ducts are specifically designed when you're sad or depressed to help release that and cleanse the body of it. But, like, I didn't shed any tears. It was like, what the heck? What, did I just, like, shed the emotions through sweat or something? I don't know.
I don't know. I did find a couple of times when, like, I wouldn't cry or have much of the effects of that. But, you know, I get that sort of sensation of the chest going up and down type of thing that happens when you kind of get upset. But it was very strange. There was not even a sight of a tear, you know.
No.
And those moments would last very briefly compared to how normal people cry. You know, I'm talking a few seconds. But at least after those few seconds, I would go, I feel a bit better now. But it's almost impossible to cry. And first of all, before people jump on this bandwagon, I want to hear your thoughts about this. I don't think that's due to society particularly. I don't think that men don't cry because of society. Because that's what they'll say, right? They'll say men can't cry because the society's made it so that, you know, it's not comfortable for them to cry, but you can cry around me. I think there's just something instinctual in men that puts us off crying, because I think it perhaps somewhat has been evolutionary disadvantage to us to do that. I don't feel like it's because we don't want to. I feel it's because we like physically can't.
Well, I've actually tried to cry. Just like, I need to cry. Why can't I cry? And whether I was relaxed or not, I couldn't. Steven Crowder, you know, his Louder with Crowder show, they were discussing briefly the difference between like men and women. And one of the things that came up was they were talking about crying specifically. And Steven Mr. Crowder, he was like, there are studies that have shown that, and not just studies, but like personal experience, that men don't cry until it's the final resort. Like, they've got nothing left in the tank. Like, let's say you've been really angry and you have no more words. Your anger has just gotten so high that it can't go anymore. Then you get frustrated, and then after that, you cry. Crying is the last straw. And he's like, ladies, if your man is crying, you need to check up on him because he is at his wit's end. And that struck me because, like, when I was younger, 14, 15, I was a very hot-headed kid. Still kind of hot-headed, but working on it, you know. And my dad and I would get into it, and we would scream at each other for like 10, 15 minutes, it felt like. And then afterwards, I'd go outside because I needed to cool down, because if it went any further, it'd get physical. You know, I needed to get away.
Yeah.
And I would really feel like crying, but then I wouldn't let myself cry in those moments because, like, I cannot cry right now because I don't want anyone coming out here and trying to be like, oh, it's okay. You're like, I don't like that emotion, the emotionality of some ladies where they're just like, they get all motherly, and I know that's an instinct that they have. Like, I'm not dissing them at all, and I know a lot of guys really like it. But if I'm going to cry, I want to do it alone and just let it out where I'm not interrupted. To me, it's the interruption that makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah. If you kind of stop crying, and then if someone says to you, it's okay, let it out, it goes right back in. Right back in, boys.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
It doesn't come out anymore. It's like, I'm done. You ruined the moment. I'm just going to go punch a tree.
Yeah. I couldn't think of anything more accurate than that, actually. Yeah, that's what happens. It's a strange response, and you're right. It is when you only hit the very rock bottom. I think it's because when men are pragmatic in more senses, they don't see a pragmatic benefit to crying. You know, perhaps there obviously is an emotional benefit to it. In the sort of logical world, it doesn't feel like there is, because you think, well, instead of crying, I could actually be going around solving this fucking problem. You know, so it feels like an unnecessary reaction to have. So I think naturally, it's just not part of us to do it unless it's really, really the last resort.
And that's just biology. I mean, girls are just more emotional than guys are. And that sentence alone is going to get so much flack, like, just because the way the culture is. But girls are more emotional. Like my sisters, I've got 6 sisters. They cry a ton, especially when they're on their periods. They just can't. They are allowed to be emotional.
Yeah.
And by that allowed, I mean biologically. Whereas I'm over here like, I've been frustrated and angry for 5 days straight, and I still can't cry. So I'm gonna go punch a wall or something because I don't know how to fix this. But I'm always thinking, like, for example, if a girl has a breakup, or a guy like yells at her or something. A lot of times, they go to their girlfriends, they get hysterical about it. Maybe they'll cry, something like that. I don't know if this is just a guy thing or not. Probably is. But when somebody disrespects me or gets in my face, I remove myself from the situation. Not always immediately. I should definitely work on that. But then later, I'm like, I gotta hit this guy up. We gotta talk about this. This cannot stand. I don't have time to go and weep. I'll be frustrated. I'll be angry. Like my immediate response is, I want to rip that guy's head off. 30 minutes later, I'm like,
yeah,
go back and talk to him or her, whatever. It's not worth letting it stand. Whereas I've noticed a lot of girls just like I'm gonna go have a cry for an hour. I'm gonna take a shower and cry again, and then I'm gonna block him when he tries to, apologize.
Yeah, it's definitely a con there, isn't it? It's there's no resolution.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a big thing that you've hit on there with the differences, and not only it's not just the pros of being able to cry, but there's cons there too, because it feels like you've perhaps solved something when you haven't done anything. So there's times when you have to be pragmatic. That's definitely the better. If a woman thinks perhaps if she cries she can get rid of it, a guy thinks if he cries he's just wasted that time when he could have been researching what he could do to better himself. So that's an interesting point. I wonder if that point as well is linked to. I did see in the US that men are 4 times. I see one said 3 times, but this one I read said 4 times more likely to commit suicide than women. And do you think that's also because men are pragmatic? Because I think some people might argue, oh, it's because they're so depressed and it's so horrible they want to die. I think yes, but it takes a pragmatic person to go, right, well, things are bad. It looks like the next logical option is to kill myself. In a strange way. I wonder what you think about that conclusion.
I've read similar studies, and the ones I've read were all like, well, ladies are far, far more likely to try and kill themselves, but guys are, I think it was 4 times? It might have been as high as
this said
10, but I'm not going to go that. I'm just settle around 3 or 4 times that they just use the right tool for the job. Why? Probably because men are more logical. Girls are like, I need to slit my wrist. Guys are like, give me a gun and I'm going to blast myself where it's going to kill me. And not all girls, but like they'll take pills or slit their wrists or try to cut something like that. Not to be too graphic, like something like that.
Maybe women
and that
flirt
is
with it
more
more, though. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe sometimes the actions they're doing is to see whether they can do it or not.
And maybe it's attention seeking as well. Like a lot of girls, not all of them, and not in every walk of life, but quite a few of them, a large part of the reason why they have depression is because they're not the prettiest. They don't have the most attention. They don't look like Instagram models. And so like, well, I got to fix this by crying and trying to kill myself. But it's just interesting that guys are more logical about it. They're like, you know what? I can't see a way out of this. I don't want to talk to anyone else. Ending it like a gun or jumping from a 30-story building instead of like taking some pills.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I think the part where I perhaps disagree is that I think while I agree that there's the attention-seeking aspect in not committing suicide but almost doing it, which I think is, in a lot of ways it's a good thing because they're trying it and it doesn't really work, and they realize that perhaps if they do it, people will take them seriously because we have an issue, people taking it seriously. But I wonder maybe it's not that I don't disagree. No, not necessarily that I disagree, but I wonder the percentage of cases in men and women with circumstantial depression and where it's just like flat out depression, clinical depression. Because what you kind of described there with women was a lot of sort of circumstantial depression. They're ugly, their family doesn't love them, their boyfriend's terrible. But I wonder if it's a similar amount of cases for both of circumstantial depression. Because when I went through a depressive phase, I'll be honest with you, everything was going okay, like in my life. So, I don't know. That's just a point to bring up.
Right. No, I wouldn't disagree with you there. If I made it sound like girls only try to kill themselves for attention, that's not my intent with that statement.
No, I didn't come across like that. I was just challenging the idea of circumstantial depression, whether that's more common in women or not.
It might be, but I'm not sure purely because again, women are more emotional, so I don't know how that works.
Yeah, I would say it is. I would say it is. I think if women are generally more emotional, then I think that they're more likely to delve into issues with circumstantial depression. And I think that the suicide rate is higher amongst men because I think circumstantial depression, there's almost in the back of the head that it will slowly go away.
Right.
But if you're like proper clinically depressed and you know that you don't really see a way out, there's no clear answers, I think that's one of the reasons why the men are more likely to kill themselves. I don't just think it's because they more likely good to find the tools for the job. It's that in perhaps more male cases, there's no light at the end of the tunnel for them.
Right. No, I think you're right there. I mean, when I was the darkest time for me, I won't lie, I definitely thought about ending it all. But I had to force myself to remember, hey, this can end, but you could be perfectly fine tomorrow morning. You don't know that. I mean, for me, mine was more circumstantial, definitely, because I was physically ill. I needed to put on some weight. There was a lot of pressure from doctors. It was fear. Like, fear has been a massive player in my life, and often why I do spiral at times. So my depression was definitely more circumstantial, which kind of makes sense given I'm more emotional than, again, your average guy. Like, a lot of guys who work construction, they tend to not be really emotional about stuff. I'm a bit more emotional than some guys. I don't know why. The gene and the God was like, hey, boom, you're
If
gonna.
I remember rightly, aren't you in like a woman-based household or something, or did I make that up?
Yeah, that too. I have my mother and 6 sisters, and my little brother is like 10 years younger than me.
Oh, there you go.
So, yeah, I've always thought about that. Like, growing up when I was like 12 years old, I was like, I wonder how much less of a man I am because I have so many sisters.
Hey, maybe you're also more of a man in some ways too.
Yep, definitely. Yeah. I don't smack girls unless they're my sisters.
Yeah, you're like, yeah, that's different. So
I don't
flack.
say like I I brutalized the girls who live with me.
Like, you know, it's just what you do when you're a kid, don't you? Well, talking about the circumstantial differentiation, I also found out that white men who were aged 85 and above are the most in-risk group for committing suicide in the US. I don't know if you knew that.
Why?
That blew me away.
I did not, but I'd immediately guess it's because they're nearing the end of their lives and they don't have family anymore.
Right, and it's
like
a circumstantial situation. It's circumstantial, but it's not going to go away.
No, you're not gonna. Your family's not just gonna come back to you, especially if all of them died. Like your cousins, your uncles, your parents, your wife, maybe even a kid or two. Like, that is interesting. That ties into, I think, a bit of Western culture. Family isn't important anymore.
Right.
That's just, my neighbors were mother and daughter. They lived together. Mother was like 80. I think she's close to 90 now, if not 90. Daughter was 60s, and their family just really didn't. The mother didn't have her kids, didn't come visit her she was a great grandmother, and she didn't have many visitors outside of like some of us from my family. Her daughter, I mean, she had school. She was a school teacher, special needs, so she had that. But again, her family she didn't really see outside like 3-4 times a year until she had cancer and started to deteriorate. And then all the family was like, we got to be here. And I was like, my thought immediately was, why? Why wait till then? I know life is busy and crazy, especially when you're trying to be successful in your career. But you never know when, after the age 65, that risk just gets higher and higher. Just the risk that they're going to have a heart attack or whatever, it just gets higher with the older they get. Yeah. Whereas more so in the past than now, but a lot of black families, huge part of their culture is family. You know, grandmother, grandfather, family just sticking together.
Oh yeah, I noticed that where I live, because we don't have many black people up in the northwest of the UK, at least in my area. But we have many Asian families, and it's exactly how you're describing. Like, they live with their grandparents. They have these huge family celebrations.
Right, and then I think like down south in the States, that's the culture there is family and community. Like, they don't go for the big cities and things like that. They're like, there are still big cities down there. Don't get me wrong. But their whole thing is family and culture and community. Whereas the further north you go, to like the citified areas, kind of around where I live, the northeast United States, you get a lot of cities, which means you get a lot of broken families, you get more drug use, you get more alcohol abuse, you get more violence in the home, things like that. It's a lot harder to live in a city. You can't make enough money to cover the rent because cities are really expensive and minimum wage is really low compared to that, which is an entirely different issue right there. But yeah, I think a lot of people who aren't white, depending on where you live, they care more about family and community. And I think when you cut out family and community, you cut out a key support system and a key reason to keep going. Because a lot of, like my parents are going through a rough spot, but my dad, he says, I'm not giving up on this, because if I do, my kids won't have a dad. And that to him is really important. And if you don't have that in there, it'd be like, oh, I'm gone. Goodbye. I don't care what damage I cause. I'm out. You know, things like that. Like if you don't have a reason, and family is a huge reason. Like if you actually care about your family, it's a huge reason. Reason.
Yeah, that people kind of forget about traditions too, right? Is that family throughout human history has always been so important. In fact, I just had a guy on, I don't know which order I'm going to put these up, but we were actually talking about trees and the fungal network that connects them underneath. And I found that so interesting because that fungal network, the mother tree can find out through a fungal network who its baby saplings are in other areas of the forest. And through that fungal network, it can send food and nutrients to its children to nourish them and help them. But you don't see all this above ground, you know? And I think it's a large part of being human to have sort of a similar type of connection, you know, with those around you. I think there are more invisible connections, but nevertheless, it's what caused humanity to thrive, is living in societies. So I think as soon as we sort of begin to move away from ourselves from that, I think we lose a huge part of ourselves. I think we've perhaps become too individualistic in that way.
Definitely. I mean, once again, families are huge. Biblically, I mean, God commanded the people who follow him. He said, honor your father and mother. That was a massive commandment. Frickin' Solomon himself in Proverbs was saying you need to take care of your wife as she gets older. Like there isn't ever a command that's like, nope, forget about the widows and the orphan. Like that's a massive command in the New Testament. If people diss the Old Testament because it's outdated, the New Testament, a large part, like any of the books after, no, even in Matthew, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, like the core Gospels, one of the major things Jesus is doing is feeding the poor, healing and helping orphans and widows. And then it's a massive commandment throughout the rest of the New Testament. Everyone's saying, hey, I don't care how successful you get. I don't care what you do with your life. You need to be making sure the orphaned and the widowed, the fatherless, have food, have housing, are taken care of, have community. And I think that's part of the reason why church is really stressed in just not biblically, but modern day, is because if you don't have that community, you don't grow. And a lot of people try to go it alone. And if you're going it alone, you can't see your faults. Yeah.
Very true. It takes people on the outside to tell you got sweet corn in your teeth.
Yeah.
Actually brings back to the point that I wanted us to come on to earlier. But, you know, has religion helped you throughout this? Because, you know, I'm personally not religious. And the fact that I don't subscribe to any religion, it's not that I don't see merits in other religions or think that there's some kind of something out there, but that's a conversation for another time. But do you think religion has helped you throughout it? And do you think that perhaps the desecularization of the West has caused issues there with regarding to depression?
Yeah, I refer to it as the darkest moment of my life, time period.
Sorry, I didn't mean desecularization.
Yes,
I meant secularization.
Removal of God from culture, yes.
There it is.
For my own personal journey, I don't think I would have gotten through it alive or as well as I did without God. I'm pretty sure he's the only reason why I had the strength to get through it. And it gave me a reason to have a habit. I formed the habit of reading my Bible every morning because I was like, without it, I'm not going to get through the day. I'm not going to be able to have my own strength to get through the day. That's petered off a bit, and I've been trying to work back on that just because the Bible is fascinating and really important. But I don't think if I had not had religion, I don't think I would have gotten through it the same or even as successfully.
But what is it doing? What is religion doing for you?
Well, this one is hard to measure because you have to be able to believe that he exists. But I'm entirely positive that religion, just on a physical level, having God and being in a relationship with him gave me the strength to get through because I can't and he can. That's commonly quoted in Christian circles as I can't but he can. On a more emotional level, it's the constant reminders that life is hard. Like a lot of what like some of the books in the New Testament, like James, a massive part of their story is you're going to have suffering and trials. But no matter what happens, you still have God by your side. It's a reassurance that I don't think a lot of people have. is it doesn't matter if you're alone, doesn't matter if you have to face the lions by yourself. God is always with you, and he's never left you before. He's never left anyone before. He's not going to leave you now. Like that promise that he's going to give the strength, the peace. That's another thing that I had that I never thought I would have. I was incredibly joyful and had incredible amounts of peace for 2 months out of that dark time, and that was when I was closest in the Word and with God. It's one of the things he promises, and I can't explain it. Like as a human being, there's no way that I can go, I'm joyful, like an inner joy that kept me going, and peace that kept me going. Like I'd be like, oh, I'm getting off frustrated. God, I just need peace. And 5 minutes later, I'd be like, I would be calm. I could focus on what needed to be done, go to sleep, whatever it was. And that's not something I've been able to figure out, like just logically. Like why was I so joyful despite how much pain I was in? I don't have a reason for that other than it being a God thing. It was definitely a support system. Honestly, without it, I would have been falling over like I'd lost an entire leg.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense because I saw some more figures, basically. This is only over a short period of time, but I think it's related. Social media too, but children between ages 12 to 17, there was an increase from 8.7% of them feeling they had depression in 2005 to like 12.7% in 2015. Yes, that's like a 30% increase. And I think a lot of people are becoming secularized. You know, there's a push away from God. I'm not religious. And what I found is when I was going through my toughest of times, my parents were there, obviously, but, you know, when you're depressed, you don't really want to be relying on your parents. You just don't, you don't want to get them involved. So I felt like I was on my own. So anytime I felt like there was any strength, I felt like I had to force that out from within. I think the benefit of Christianity is that obviously you still have to force things out, you still have to try, but it's nice to have something physical, like a book there that you can refer to, people who perhaps gone through this before, or lessons that can be learnt from it, and knowing that there's someone there beside you who is looking after you, that patriarchal figure. I can only imagine that does someone good when they are looking at the light at the end of the tunnel.
And add to that, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of what Christianity at its core is community and supporting the weak, the poor, the widowed, the orphaned. And my best friends, my best friend and his family were huge supports to me during that time. And I'm not saying you have to be a Christian or religious to be a support to somebody, but it's just second nature to a lot of true Christians that I know. It's, hey, you're suffering and I know you, let me help you. And not in like a condescending way. And it's interesting to see. As for the world becoming more secular, one of my friends shared a paper with me. It was a blog post, but based off a psychiatrist and some studies. And the guy he's like, okay, so what happens if we get rid of God? What happens if God doesn't exist anymore in culture? And what he found was after 3 generations, it went from like community and less violence and things like that to a lot of sex outside of marriage. And then he found from there that led to a complete deterioration of all civilization. He found that within 3 generations, his theory was, based upon previous civilizations like the Roman Empire, that he found within 3 generations of this happening, either the civilization didn't exist anymore or it was conquered by another one. And then the author of the blog was like, all right, we can start looking at this for America specifically. He said, all right, we start losing God around the 1960s. Where does that lead us? Sexual revolution. That lines up perfectly. And now we're finding more divorce rates and higher mental health issues. Okay, that lines up with what he said. The next step is the country of the United States falls apart completely. And he's like, I really hope that doesn't happen. It's still a theory. It hasn't been tested, so we don't know if it's going to go all the way there.
It hasn't been tested. It's all happening the way it's described, but it hasn't been tested.
He said, maybe we can reverse it. I don't know, but let's have some hope that we can reverse it. But it's interesting that that's what happens. And even if on no other level, just having a set of morals that you are obligated to follow means you're going to be a better person. Do not steal. Do not murder. Those are key. Do not cheat on your wife with your neighbor. Don't have sex with animals, things like that. Those are parts.
To add on to that, sorry, because there will be non-religious people listening to this like myself, But the meaning in those,
Mm-hmm.
in what you're saying, is it goes deeper, because it goes to the point where the reason why you shouldn't have sex with your neighbor is the amount of chaos that can. It's not just because that's a thing. It's not just said for fun.
Yeah.
There's so many layers of how that can affect the community you live in, how that will affect your own mental health, how that'll affect your children who then may not have certain issues. There's a whole series of links there. I'm sorry for interrupting you, but I just wanted to bring that up for others like myself who wouldn't have thought about that.
No, that's completely accurate. In fact, one thing that I found completely fascinating about the Old Testament is God gives the Israelites an entire list of animals they can't eat. And most of the animals on that list, science has found that if you eat it, it's not particularly healthy for you, like pigs, for example.
Right.
And a lot of people were like, the Israelites didn't know that. They was like, we have to trust God because He's our God. If we don't trust him, we lose. And we see that several times throughout the Old Testament, that when they didn't trust God, they were captured by other races and conquered and whatever. But the point is, God never does something that's for our ill, as far as I can tell, like just biblically and historically. So,
yeah.
And that's the point. Like, the morals are there because they give us a grounding to live a good life, not because it's a set of rules that we have to follow, like don't jaywalk.
Yeah, they're not. It's not arbitrary or just legal. It's like it's got genuine, deep reasons that they're there. And I would argue, as other atheists would, and this is the argument they'll come at, is that you want to follow the myths and structures of the world and structures that have existed long before you, because there's so much you'll learn from that. There's so much human history in there that morals will be extracted from, and those morals will be in things like the Bible. And there's reasons why we should listen to them. Doesn't all have to be magic if you don't want it to be, but there's reasons why certain rules exist, and morals should be in place to help prevent you from getting in such dire situations.
Yeah, I mean, respect your parents. That's pretty key. Why is it key? Because what happens when you don't respect your parents? There's chaos in the house.
Yeah.
The home deteriorates. You yourself, speaking to someone who has been in such situations, doesn't do anything positive. It leads to strife and chaos, and typically it's done out of a rebellious spirit, and that rebellious spirit is typically centered in, hey, these people who are above me, I don't trust them anymore, I think I know better, and all of that. And in certain situations where you've got abusive parents, you being rebellious is kind of what's going to happen, and it might not be a bad thing necessarily. But there's wisdom to be found in the older generations, especially parents. And there are a lot of things my parents have said or told me that I'm like, yeah, no, I don't agree with you. But there's a lot more where just because I chose to listen to them as I've gotten older, respect them, believe me, for 2 years straight, I was like, no, screw you, parents.
Yeah.
I found that they know what they're talking about regarding certain things. I mean, you don't take everything they say like it's the truth from God Almighty,
but it can be a guideline.
You definitely can't just ditch it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you can bounce off what they say. That's totally right, though, as well. Like, as you get older, as you start getting into your 20s, you're like, oh, yeah, those things my parents told me. Yeah, that made a lot of sense, because they've been to fire, they've touched fire, and they've been burnt, or their parents have been burnt for those lessons to be passed down, and that's why they still get passed down, So there's a lot of wisdom in there. Well, unfortunately, the thing is, I want to ask you so many more questions, but I cannot fit it into this new bloody podcast time that I've got. I use 45 minutes to an hour now on my podcast. So it's a shame, really. But the fact is, we've covered a lot of great ground here, I think. I think people will find this certainly interesting to hear two guys who have had it and who have been through it, discussing what it's like. But also, we're looking at things like why the differences between men and women who experience it. We looked at reasons for it, secularization, social media, inaction, but looking at those at a slightly deeper level than people tend to give them credit for, and also things like over identifying with it as well, and how those can affect people. And we managed to bring in some nice bits of information too. So I want to thank you very much for being on the podcast and taking your time here, and just being a great educational source for people.
Yeah, appreciate it. I'm glad to be here, dude. It was fun.
Yeah, it was a good time. And please tell us, by the way, because I want to bring people your way, tell us about your podcast and places people can find you.
Yeah, so I also have a podcast titled Wandering Thoughts. You can literally find it anywhere podcasts are. YouTube, Spotify, the ones nobody thinks about anymore, like Google Podcasts. I didn't even know that existed till I started a podcast. The whole goal with my podcast is simply to have open and honest discussions, kind of like what we're doing here. because I found that that's something that's lacking in culture. And I realized that after having a political discussion with my friends, one of which who agreed with me mostly, another one who didn't really agree with us, and we could do it cordially. And I was like, we need to bring this to other people in some way. So, hence, that's the podcast. I mean, I guess I could list where I'm at on social media. Even if you could spell the names I have is like Taros_Taron, because it's Elvish. So I don't know if anyone can find. It's like my Twitter and my Instagram.
Yeah, if people didn't know, Joe is actually an elf.
Yeah, I've got the pointy ears. I've got a bow hiding in the closet.
Because obviously we've known each other for almost a year now, or if not a year now.
Mm-hmm.
But I certainly enjoy, when I pop in every now and then and have a little listen to your podcast. I'm always pleasantly surprised with the content that's on there, because across the internet, every man and his dog has a podcast nowadays. So it's quite rare to find a decent one.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I highly recommend it. And if you want to listen as well to Joe's old beliefs on depression, go to episode 2 or 3.
Yeah, it wasn't called something like causes for depression or something like that.
Yeah, it was. But yeah, no, thank you very much, and we'll talk again soon.
Yeah, definitely, Ben.
All right, we did it.
Yeah, that was awesome.